Salam and welcome to the Logic of the Birds podcast. With me today to discuss the poetry of Amir Khusraw, Professor Prashant Keshavmurthy, Professor of Persian and Iranian Studies at McGill University, and Professor Shankar Nair, Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia. Professor Keshavmurthy, could you please tell us a little bit about your relationship to Amir Khusraw and his poetry? How did you first get interested in it? What have you come to appreciate about it? What's made you interested in it?
Well, firstly, thank you very much for inviting me, and congratulations on your wonderful podcast series. To answer your question, like most South Asians interested in Amir Khusraw, I first encountered him in a qawwali performance one Thursday evening at the shrine in Delhi during my undergrad years, the shrine of Amir Khusraw's beloved Sufi preceptor, Nizamuddin Awliya, the Chishti lineage, spiritual lineage. And verses attributed to Khusraw in Persian and Hindi, which is the North Indian vernacular associated with Muslim poets in the region, are standard fare in the tradition of ecstatic Sufi devotional singing called qawwali. So that was my first encounter in my early 20s. And at the time, I knew no Persian, and I just caught little more than the erotic drift of the Hindi verse that Khusraw is supposed to have uttered while in Bengal on hearing the news of Nizamuddin's death back in Delhi. And the famous verse, which is often sung in qawwali routines, goes like this: Gori sovei sej par, mukh par dare kes, chal Khusraw ghar apne, rain bhain chundes, rain bhain chundes. The beauty sleeps on the bed, her ringlets or tresses covering her face. Let's go home, Khusraw, night has set over the world. So the verse imagines Nizamuddin as a beautiful woman, as per the convention in North Indian vernaculars, where love happens between a man and a woman. But that an empirically male poet could eroticize another empirically male poet as a woman, and that this was normal, struck me at the time, though not now, as remarkable. What still strikes me now is how the parallel images across this verse's two hemistichs, the beloved's tresses covering her pale face and the night setting over the world, implying that the beloved's face is the sky and the night her hair, recalls such parallelisms from the Persian ghazal. It's something I learned only later. But it's this sort of code mixing that attracted me and still attracts me to his poetry, though I now almost exclusively work on his Persian corpus that we know him to have authored, rather than on the scores of Hindi riddles, songs, and poems that oral culture has attributed to him in the century since he died in 1325. You also asked me what I've come to appreciate about his poetry. In this case, his Persian poetry over time. I'll say more about this later, but broadly for now, I appreciate the fact that he matches the stylistic traits of the masters of each genre he writes in. These are masters writing before him and to the west of him in Iran and the Persianate world at large. But he bends the each genre he's writing in, to specific ends. But I'll say more on this later.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Professor Nair, what about you? Were you also introduced to Khusraw through qawwali, and what have you come to love about his verses?
Yes, of course, through qawwali. I think that's going to be a common story for many South Asians. Yes, hearing him at the dargah, hearing recordings, it's immediately captivating. There's no doubt about it. I remember being awestruck as I first started to learn Persian and first able to start to understand the lyrics. How many of these poems? I mean, it wasn't even words. It wasn't even language. There's some poems, one poem in particular, one of the favorites that's sung at dargahs and mazars. It's a quote from a hadith, and then the rest of it is a bunch of syllables. These are syllables that are, attributed to them as some sense of power or assistance in dhikr or something like this. But for it to become such a captivating performance when the words don't mean anything, at least at the semantic level. And so just all of the different kinds of learning and art that are encompassed in this singular figure. It's not just the lyrics, it's also the musicality. And of course, a great deal of innovation in music. It's also attributed to Khusraw. He's said to be an inventor of instruments. Basically, Khusraw was for me, my relationship with him is something that helped me to become interested in poetry more than just words on a page, but as something that occurs in a context, in collaboration with music, the emotions, the context of a dargah, the context of a mazar. It really just opened me up to whole new dimensions of poetry, what it is and what it does. Whereas before that, it had more been the business of learning Persian in a classroom through dictionaries and grammar books and things like this. I'll also just say, perhaps on maybe a slight note of South Asian pride, as I got into the world of Persian studies and found it dominated, some might say controlled, by a kind of Iranian nationalism. Khusraw just struck me as this wonderful avenue to open up Persian studies into something broader. I can recall certain experiences with very, very senior scholars in Persian studies who shall remain unnamed, who would just end up getting frustrated with me and would sort of finally reach their boiling point and say, Shankar, can you name to me one Indian Persian poet, just anyone, who's of any value, of any enduring legacy? And I flabbergasted reply, Amir Khusraw? And then they stop in their tracks and say, oh, yeah, well, we really consider him an Iranian, really. He's one of us, which is just astounding in a million and one different ways. But he is that South Asian figure. Of course, there are scores and scores of astoundingly talented South Asian poets, but he's the one who seems to have broken through even that barrier and broken through the myopia of our modern day presentist lens. So for perhaps reasons of South Asian pride, I may say, attracted me to him all the more.
No, Khusraw's great. He's one of my all-time favorite poets. Since you mentioned this kind of context, him being Indian, and in the context of the dargahs and the sung poetry and the musical performances and even the courts, could you give us a brief intro to his life? Where was he born? Where did he live? Where was his family from? What did he do for a living? So we can flesh out this kind of context and help us understand his poetry a bit better.
Sure, I can get us started, and Prashant, please add anything that you care to. So yes, Khusraw's dates are 1253 to 1325. He is, of course, one of the greatest poets of medieval India. His Persian corpus is safely attributed to him, and then there are scores of Hindavi poems, Hindavi being this early form of Proto-Hindi Urdu. Really, it was the sorts of vernacular Hindavi that you found spoken around Delhi, what's called Kariboli. He eventually would attain the title of Tuti-i Hindi, the Parrot of India, as he's so well known. Attributed to Khusraw is this kind of synthesis of Hindu and Muslim culture into this broader Hindustani synthesis. And as I mentioned earlier, a great deal of contributions beyond the realm of poetry are attributed to Khusraw. Innovations in Indian classical music, the inventor of instruments, in fact. Qawwali music itself is sometimes attributed to Khusraw, he being the inventor of it. By most accounts, it's hard to get precise dates, of course, as usual, but around 1272 or 1273, Khusraw became a disciple of the prominent Sufi master of Delhi, Nizam Awliya, of the Chishti Sufi order, and maintained this relationship until his master passed away in 1324. That is the more Sufi-oriented side of Khusraw's biography. Khusraw also had a vibrant life in the courts. He served many rulers and regional rulers and otherwise of the Sultanate period. He traveled across and was patronized through many courts in India. Jalaluddin Khalji and Alauddin Khalji are the two most prominent patrons that are associated with him. Khusraw was simply a prolific writer in both poetry and prose. He wrote in Arabic, he wrote in Persian, depending on which parts of the corpus one will attribute to him. Of course, Hindavi vernaculars as well. He wrote 5 diwans of poetry, which contain poetry in all of the major forms. As Prashant mentioned earlier, he sort of sets this pattern in motion for the later tradition of aspiring to being the kind of poet who can work in all of the genres, who knows the masters, the prior masters of all the genres, and then imitates and innovates upon all of them. This becomes sort of the standard of what a great poet is. Khusraw is a big part of establishing that. I'll follow Sunil Sharma and Paul Luzensky, the way that they set up Khusraw's life in their wonderful work in the Bazaar of Love, by sort of paralleling the main strokes of Khusraw's biography with the biography of Rumi. The main difference being that Rumi didn't really have a life in the courts, as patronized in the courts, but otherwise there's a lot of quite striking parallels. Both Khusraw and Rumi were fleeing the Mongols, though in different directions. Rumi was, of course, going west, and Khusraw was going southeast. Khusraw grew up in Central Asia, part of his childhood also being spent in Balkh, in Afghanistan, which is also the land where Rumi's family hails from. Though it should be noted, and we'll talk more about this later, I'm sure, Khusraw does very self-consciously identify himself as a South Asian, as an Indian. If Rumi had Shams, right, this close, intimate friend who set his heart on fire, Khusraw, of course, has his great Sheikh Nizamuddin Awliya. Both Rumi and Khusraw originally come from Turkic stock. Both of them are invested in music. Both of them write in mixed language verse. Rumi perhaps less prominently so, but he of course does mix his Persian with Arabic and also Greek. Khusraw adds Hindavi even into his Persian, right? So of course there is a set of purely Hindavi corpus attributed to Khusraw, which is of a disputed authorship, but even within his Persian, Khusraw is integrating all sorts of local words from the local dialect and vernacular. This is a theme across many of Khusraw's works, announcing himself as a South Asian, in fact, proclaiming the superiority of South Asia in different ways. I'll say more about that later. Just as for his death, I'll say that Khusraw passed away shortly after Nizamuddin Awliya. In popular memory, it is said that he passed away in grief, separated from his great sheikh, his most intimate friend. About 6 months later, he passes away. Khusraw is buried in the same famous dargah of Nizamuddin Awliya in Delhi today.
Thank you for that, Professor Keshavmurthy. Yes, can you add to that and flesh out this picture a bit for us?
I can't really improve on Shankar's. He's captured the main strokes, as he said. Just a few details. Khusraw's father and father's father belonged to a group that Khusraw's friend in the same court, Ziauddin Baruni, the historian, called Mola Zadegan, which is manumitted slaves of Central Asian stock. And this is important because across his ghazals, I've counted at least 85 mentions of the word chakir and banda, both synonyms for slave. And his ghazals, we'll talk about this more later, but one of, not the only one, but sort of a central thematic strand in his ghazals and in his long narrative poetry is exploring modes of servitude, both to the Sultan and to God via God's friends, via God's saints or Sufis, in this case Nizamuddin Awliya mainly, while his mother was the daughter of an Indian notable at court. So in a way, one could say that Khusraw's works could be read as a creative synthesis of these two identities, right? On the one hand, meritocratically insisting on individual effort and accomplishment, and creatively distorting, on the other hand, the formal rules of Persian literature to accommodate vernacular Indian poetics within Persian. Right. I see him as a kind of, not everywhere all the time, but every now and then, at key moments maybe across his genres, engaging in a kind of what the Russian formalists would call a kind of, deforming or estranging effect, where you bend the forms you're working in to connote alternative possibilities without actually estranging the form completely, right? And in this sense, I think he exploited his location on the eastern. This is an observation that Alice Agabe makes in her book on Amir Khusraw, which I'll mention later. He exploits his location on the eastern frontier of the Muslim-ruled world, Darul Islam, to craft maverick poetics that synthesized Perso-Arabic and Sanskritic Hindavi motifs, plots, figures of speech and genres, right? And in that sense, I would add to what Gabe says, he consciously imitated Nizami of Ganje, who died in 1209. Ganje is today a city in Azerbaijan, and at the time ensconced between the Seljuk Turkic Sunni Muslim domain and the Greek Orthodox, Georgian and Byzantine domains. It was a contact zone similar to Delhi. And Nizami, in his quintet of long poems, or Masnavis, exploited his own interstitial location between the Persianized Sunni Muslim Seljuk Empire and the Greek Orthodox world to produce creative Muslim Persian inversions and appropriations of Greek Christian motifs, plots, and values. We see Khusraw's poetics on display across his oeuvre, which includes a quintet in imitation of Nizami's, as well as compositions, of course, in every genre of Persian and Persian verse and prose, as Shankar said. And the only other thing I'll add is, since you asked for amusing anecdotes, it can't have been amusing for him, but it is for us, arguably. He was kidnapped or fell. Well, he was kidnapped, actually captured in 1285 while in Multan in Punjab by a Mongol general who he described in a poem. Thus, this is Sunil Kumar's translation, he sat on his horse like a leopard on a hill. His open mouth smelt like an armpit. Whiskers fell from his chin like pubic hair.
That's a pretty graphic description. It's a pretty good diss. A mouth like armpit with whiskers like pubic hair. Yeah. Well, I did want to get a sense. So, did he make his living at the court? Did he make his living as a poet? Did he make his living I'm assuming maybe his father a military person? How did he make his living? We mentioned he moved between the court and the dargahs, but what in his time in Delhi at the time, what was the courts? What was the court culture? What was going on in the courts there? What was going on in the dargahs? What was the relationship between the two?
The best account I know of this relationship, which is a tension-ridden relationship in this period, is Sunil Kumar's book, The Emergence of the Delhi Sultanate, as well as his essays. The late Sunil Kumar, the great historian of the Delhi Sultanate, who argued that, in a sense, there were two domains of sovereignty, that of Nizamuddin Awliya and the Sufi. In fact, the word dargah is used by Khusraw himself, both for the Sufi shrine, the Sufi hospice, let's say the court of the Sufi, but also the Sultan's court, right? And that sort of ambivalence of the word is important because it actually becomes a structuring principle of Khusraw's own Masnavis, which come with double dedications, both to the Sultan in question and to Nizamuddin Awliya, and to the other. He also recounts, for example, in No Seper in the Nine Skies, he runs through all the major Sufi preceptors before Nizamuddin and then Nizamuddin himself. The relationship between these two spaces, Sunil Kumar observes, was one of tension. I mean, Nizamuddin famously by making no mention of the Sultan of the time, in a way discounts his sovereignty and arrogates sovereignty to himself and to God. There is that kind of, polite disdain, I suppose, by the Sufi towards the Sultan, but also Nizamuddin's use in his Malfuzat, his discourses, 118 discourses that were set down by his pupil and by Amir Khusraw's friend and colleague at the same court, Hasan Sidzi. In those discourses, Nizamuddin uses the word Turk or Turk in a way that disambiguates individuals like Khusraw of Turkic origin from the military hypermasculine meaning that the word Turk had in courtly culture. He called him Turk Allah, the Turk of God. It's a title that subtly but clearly distinguishes Khusraw by his divine object of loyalty from the Turks who served kings and were thus implicitly unfree.
No, thank you. That's very helpful. Professor Nair, anything else to add? I mean, who are the people who were in charge? We know that in terms of the Dargah culture in Delhi, the Chishtis, were there other Sufis around there? And then in terms of the courts, who were these people who were ruling? What were they doing? Was Khusraw's family involved in the military? And can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, his father was a military man. Khusraw's own involvement, I don't actually believe so, Prashant. Do you know? I don't think he ever.
No, I think he was one of those. He was involved in the chancellery. The fact that he wrote, apart from the dedications to sultans and his masnavis, he wrote Ejaz-e Khusravi, some of which is actually explicitly, royal epistles, courtly genres like Insha, basically, chancellery prose, points to his. Also, the other thing is, across his masnavis, in his prefatory frames, he's obsessed with money. He wants to make money, but he has a very difficult relationship with it. He, like Nizami, he wants to be paid and paid handsomely. He even has visions of a cloud raining down pearls on him in a dream, and that's what prompts him to compose the Nine Skies. The cloud pelts him with pearls, and he kind of bolts out of sleep, right? So he's obsessed with money, but and of course, then he interprets the cloud as an allegory for the Sultan, right? So he wants to be paid and paid well, and he's probably a salaried poet. Yeah, kind of a secretary come poet, I would say. Not really military. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so a number of his masnavis, he, as the court poet, he's either imagining it or he was present, right? I mean, he's describing the armies marching off, and he was, in praising the patron. He's describing the battles, and so he's clearly there, deeply invested in the court culture. We have letters of him, when his patron gets transferred, he follows his patron. Sometimes he laments at having to leave his mother behind in Delhi in one famous letter, things like this. So he was deeply implicated in the courts, and yes, always concerned with his livelihood. His poetry was his livelihood. It was his source of income, and that was part of the reason why he had to jump through so many courts, constantly in search of a patron. In his own poetic voice, Prashant may have more to say about this, but on the one hand, there is a thread through Khusraw that doesn't want to view these two worlds as hermetically sealed off and as separate. He's quite self-conscious at times and clear that he wants his poetry to be appreciated by both of these audiences and everywhere in between. A true poet who's at the height of his craft should write the sort of thing that will be banging at the dargah, right? And will also move a king, move a patron. It'll help him get paid. It should appeal to all those audiences in different ways at one and the same time. And the ideal audience member is someone who can appreciate it across all of these different modes simultaneously. In one sense, he's not viewing the worlds as separate. They're different sides of a spectrum, maybe. But his craft, his work as a poet, is fully at home in both. On the other hand, yes, you do sometimes find in Khusraw's, at least his poetic voice, a sense that these worlds are incompatible. As Prashant says, he is often just, looking for money, looking for a paycheck, looking for a payday. And there'll be moments in some of his poems, especially those wonderful lines at the end of the ghazal where he's, naming himself, as is the convention. He'll express a kind of regret at his vices, at his flaws, at how he's failing to live up to what his Sheikh Nizamuddin wants him to be. And so at one and the same time, it's a continuous universe for him, and at other times he does see a tension between them, and it causes him to be self-reflective and sometimes regretful.
Oh, thank you. That's really fantastic and helpful. Well, speaking of his poetry now, I wanted to ask Professor Keshavmurthy, could you give us some example of some poems or verses of Khusraw's that are some of your favorites or that are particularly celebrated and beloved, and help us understand why they're so special?
Okay, so he has, apart from the five long poems, Masnavi's narrative and rhymed couplets, they're composed in brisk imitation of the late 1290s, early 1300s of Nizami's quintet. Apart from that, he has historical Masnavis, historical in the sense that they, as Sunil Sharma observes, he had no precedent for this, which is to say that he epicized living contemporaries, which had not been done in Persian before. But what Sunil Sharma doesn't remark on, and I think, what intrigues me is this was normal in Sanskrit epic poetry, and I think he may well have had, given his interest in Sanskrit literary culture and intellectual culture, he may well have modeled it. He didn't need to know any Sanskrit for this, because he was surrounded by colleagues who knew it, and he may well have modeled these particular historical epics on that precedent. But apart from that, let's talk about his ghazals. He has over 1,700 of them, and before I read out one, I should say that because the one I'm about to read out is atypical, and it's one of these examples of a deformatory, eccentric, maverick poetics, but that should not give you the impression that this is all he does, because in many respects he is continuous with Rumi and other ghazals. So the main theme, I would say, like in the ghazals of Diwan-e-Shams, Rumi, is the arch trope of the Persian and Persianate ghazal, which is Naz-o-Niyaz, the lover speaker's abject pleading, and the beloved's cruel heedlessness, which is the central fiction of the genre. And Khusraw's ghazals are going to be used as central fiction to explore states of servitude, which may be more specific to Khusraw. So the word slave or slavery, bandagi, appear constantly in opposition to Amiri and Azadi. So Amir, which is his first name, Amir Khusraw, in the terminology of the Delhi Sultanate, referred to a free nobleman. And of course, Khusraw was, his pen name referred to the Sasanian monarch Khusraw Parviz. And so his name was, when he often refers to himself at the ends of his ghazals as in Bande Khusraw, this slave Khusraw, it was a delicious opposition, right? A delicious contradiction that would have struck his contemporaneous readers, right? So his ghazals extend, I would say, this exploration of servitude and also the literary tradition that called itself Mazhab-e-Ishq, the school of love, that beginning in the 900s across Khorasan, celebrated the Muslim self's desire for non-Muslim beloveds as a way to emphasize and authenticate the inwardness of the Muslim experience of God's oneness. This is how I understand that school anyway, right? So Attar is a famous, Fariduddin Attar, the 12th century poet, is a great example of this, both in his ghazals and his masnavis. Khusraw had models for this. Also in the Prosimetrum of Sabaneh, they're called Sabaneh, the events in the lives of lovers from the 10th century by Ahmad Ghazali. These were some of his precedents for this lyric exploration of pagan beloveds, right? As a way to sort of distend Muslim selfhood, I suppose, right? He also composed around 55 of those, around 55 to 60 of his over 1,700 ghazals are explicit responses to ghazals by Sadi. They use the same meter, they use the same radif or refrain, they invert and play. There's basically a ludic relationship we see with the ghazals, with sort of one of the founding poets of the ghazal genre, namely Sadi, who was writing a generation before him. What were the major terms that Khusraw and his milieu upheld as virtues of the ghazal? The three terms that I can think of that he constantly brings up across his meta-literary statements are Ravani, īhām, and Shirini. Ravani is fluency or flowingness. Īhām is sort of punning or aparonomasia or ambiguity, and Shirini is sweetness. It's not easy to specify what he understands by flowingness or fluency, but I would say when you actually read his ghazals in line, continuously with those of Sadi and Rumi, and those of his younger contemporaries, Khwaja Kirmani and Hafiz, you see him using the meter he's writing in to parcel out units of meaning across units of sound, marking off the ends of such semantic units with internal rhymes and assonances, right? This makes each distich a distinct unit of sound and sense whose elements participate in each other. So I'll just give you a quick example before I read out the main ghazal I have in mind. It goes like this. This is just one couplet, which is an example of this. Rizi to khun bar asatan shuyam man az ashke ravan kalude dide chun tavan an asatan pakra. Right, now the meter is one of the oldest with roots in Arabic. It's the eightfold sound rajaz. Mustafilun, 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 mustafilun. You spill my blood at the threshold. I wash it with my flowing tears. For how could one see polluted thus, that pure threshold? Now in the first hemistich, the first foot corresponds to you spill my blood, rizi to khun. The second to on the threshold, bar asatan. The third to I wash it with, shuyam manaz. And the fourth to flowing tears, ashke ravan. Now, these internal rhymes suggest that the beloved's threshold, the lover's flowing tears, and the rhetorical how could and pure threshold participate in each other's meanings. So, these distinct meanings leak into one another because of rhyme. Okay? And at the end of every distich in this ghazal, you have this expected assonantal opening out at the distich's end, akra, right? That's how it ends. It sort of appears each time as an unraveling of this rhyme-knotted parcel of sound and sense. But also, as I said, Khusraw bends these genre traits that he shares with others for different purposes. So the ghazal I have that I find is eccentric is one that this is another theme running through his ghazals that collapse, and his masnavis as well to some extent, the collapsing of the distance between the Turkic Muslim Persianate lyric self and the Indian or Hindu or Brahmin lyric beloved, right? So I'll just read out the ghazal couplet by couplet, with a translation for each couplet. Sazad ke sajde konand ey barhamane ajami, hame butanat ke mihrab chashme har sanami. It's fitting, Persian Brahmin, that each of your idols should stoop before you, for you're the mihrab of each idol's eye. Dar ab aine bini hamishe surat khish ke aftab parasti o but parasti hami. You always gaze upon your mirror and water and mirror, for you're a sun worshipper and an idolater too. Hame vilayat ruye to yagist magar, savad khitte to andaki qalami. But also that you can vocalize the second hemistich differently because short vowels are not orthographically marked. So you could say savad khitte to andaki qalami. Is every province of your face rebellious except the region/blackness/ writing of your territory/ story, slight and written and slender? There are too many meanings here clustering for me to read it out. I'd rather have shown it to you on a screen. So yeah, the third couplet. Befar ke taj zumurrud barar chun tavus, dara be jilve ke tavus hindi e ajami. Mount an emerald crown on your head like a peacock. Come display yourself as a hierophany, for you're an Indian peacock, O Persian. Burun kisham ragejan, bahar chi kisham barash, ze ishk to ke na az lat somnat kami. Should I draw out my jugular? Why should I go to the trouble for your love? For you're no less than Lat of Somnath. Lat referring to the pagan goddess of Mecca. Darig nis ke suzand hinduvan khudra ze dostist ke chun somnat muhtarami. It's no grieving matter that Hindus should burn themselves. It's for love that you're revered like Somnath. Somnath refers to this famous temple in Gujarat, which was raided multiple times by Mahmud of Ghazna. It became a sort of symbol in Persian literature it became the paragon of the House of Idols. And therefore of interest to the Mazhab-e-Ishq tradition as a kind of metaphor for, master metaphor for idolatrous Muslim love, right? نموده می شود آفاق در صفای تنت تا آبگینه هندی naked جام جمی. The universe appears in your body's translucence. You're an Indian crystal, not Jamshid's world-revealing goblet. سیاه تخته, this is my favorite, سیاه تخته هندو بود سفید رخم تو از سیاهی هند ز سفیدی رقمی. My white face is a slate of the Hindu. Of India's ink, you are a cipher of whiteness. Or of India's indistinction, you are a cipher of whiteness. Or of India's ink, you are a cipher of whiteness. چوگش خسرو جادو زبون غمزه تو به خواب بستنش افسون هندوی چه دمی. Says Khusraw the conjurer is enthralled to your glancing eyes. What are Indian incantations to keep him from sleep? Broadly, I just make a few broad remarks about this ghazal, especially certain very dense, punning, īhām-laden couplets. This one, Siyah takhte Hindu buvat safid rukham. My white face is the slate of the Hindu, which is to say, am I writing the Hindu? The Hindu is conventionally black because of dark-skinned, but also, in this case, is he a calligraphic stroke of black ink? Am I writing the Hindu, or am I being written by the Hindu? Is my Turkic, which is conventionally pale-skinned, white-skinned face, the surface on which the Hindu makes his marks? And if so, perhaps it's referring to the khat, or the sort of black cheek down that sprouts on, a teenage boy's or a pubescent boy's face, which was a sign of erotic desirability. So, here Khusraw begins to collapse into the Hindu. He becomes the Hindu, right? To as Siyah Hinds is safidi raqami. Of India's indistinction of blackness, you are a cipher of whiteness. Khusraw is his writing, but his writing, his black calligraphed writing, is the Hindu. It's rather difficult to sort of unpack this couplet, but broadly, this is one of those instances of Khusraw collapsing into an identity with the pagan beloved.
And he even says, this is not Jamshid's cup. I mean, so he negates the famous image of, the all-seeing cup of the mythological Persian king in favor of an Indic image. So he's combining and negating at the same time.
You get certain precious objects that are well known in classical Persian literature displaced by their Indian counterparts.
And then the reference in, I think it was the second couplet about the mirror and water and the sun worshipper. This seemed to me to be a reference perhaps to the Queen of Sheba and Solomon as well too, because she's a sun worshipper famously in the story of the Quran, and then comes to Solomon's palace, and he has a polished marble thing which she thinks then is water, but it turns out to just be a mirror-like surface.
I hadn't thought of that. I hadn't thought of that. Thank you. I will credit you for it if I.
Thank you so much for introducing me to this guy. It's absolutely fantastic. It's like linguistic pyrotechnics in every bait, every verse.
I mean, look at this one. Now, this refers to a familiar trope, which is the beloved's face as sprouting with cheek down and therefore breaking into rebellion, because the emergence of stubble in a way is the beginning of the end of desirability in a way, because it's the beginning of the beloved's, I suppose, resistance to the lover. But he says, is every province of your face rebellious except, or perhaps, the region, the region of your story, your territory, slight and written, or slight and slender. But also, khitte is vocalizable as khutte, which would be story, right? Are these calligraphed strokes on the page of your cheek or countenance, are they in fact your story? So yeah, you have this is an example of a familiar trope that is sort of defamiliarized through lexical density and punning.
Absolutely fantastic, simply fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor Nair. Let's turn to you now. Do you have a ghazal or another a verse that you'd like to share with us?
Yes, I have chosen two ghazals. I'm choosing what's perhaps one of the obvious ones. This is certainly one of the most famous in most collections of the full diwan of Khusraw's works. It's the first ghazal that appears in the first section, which is the ghazal Abd mi barad amen mi shavam az yar joda. Famous, well-known one, and that's the most appreciated, though there's always more to say about it. So let's go right in. The rhyme, the radif khafiye, the rhyme refrain is ad joda. So I'll go ahead and read the whole thing, because I think there's some interesting poetics going on in the unexpected deployment of this word joda. Of course, it's expected because everyone knows it's the rhyme, but often I find the sentence is setting you up to read it one way, and then the joda coming at the end somehow surprises you or creates a kind of inversion, which is very fertile. So forgive my poor pronunciation, but I'll read it as best as I can. Abr mi barad و من میشوم از یار جدا. چون کنم دل به چنین روز دلدار جدا. ابر و باران و من و یار ستاده به ودا. من جدا گریه کنان ابر جدا یار جدا. سبز نوخیز و هوا خرم و بستان سرسبز. بلبل روح سیاه مانده ز گلزار جدا. ای مرا در ته هر موی به زلفت بندی، چه کنی بند ز بندم همه یک بار جدا. دیده از بحر تو خونبار شد ای مردم چشم، مردمی کن مشو از دیده خونبار جدا. نعمت دیده نخواهم که بماند پس از این، مانده چون دیده از آن نعمت دیدار جدا. دیده صد رخنه شد از بحر تو خاکی ز رهت، زود بگیر و بکن رخنه دیوار جدا. میدهم جان مرا از من و گرت باور نیست، پیش از آن خواهی بستان و نگهدار جدا. حسن تو دیر نپاید چو ز خسرو رفتی، گل بسی دیر نماند چو شد از خار جدا. All right, so I've based myself on Lozensky and Sharma's translation in the book I already mentioned, a lovely book. I'd recommend everyone pick it up if you're interested in Khusraw, In the Bazaar of Love. But I've modified it pretty significantly to try to tease out some of the poetics here. My reason for actually wanting to follow Sharma and Lozensky is because they've tried to do something interesting here. Since the refrain is joda, they've tried to use the English word part or some derivative therefrom in every line of the poem, which is kind of interesting, and I've tried to keep that in as best as I can. The clouds rain down, and I am parted from my love. How, on a day like today, can I part my heart from my beloved? Beloved here, literally one who has my heart. How can I part my heart from one who has my heart? The sprouts are fresh, the air fragrant, the garden bright green, and the wearied black-faced nightingale parted from the rose garden. Ah, me, shackled to your every strand of hair, what are you doing, pulling me apart all at once, limb from limb? My eyes rain down blood for you, O pupil of my eye. Stand strong, don't depart on this flood of red tears. I'll no longer need the gift of sight, since after this, all that remains for the eye is parting from the gift of your visage. The eye becomes 100 cracks weeping for you. Quick, take some clay from your path and patch the cracks in the wall. I will give you my very soul, don't depart from me. If you don't believe me, if you want more than this, take it and keep it apart. Your beauty won't last long after you leave Khusraw. The rose doesn't last long, parted from the thorn. Lovely inversion there at the end. So again, the rhyme refrain is joda, this word parting, which is translated as parting. It means separation, right? Being in a state of separation. So that's coming up, of course, constantly in every line. I'll point out the lack of izafes in this poem. So for those who don't know, both in Arabic and in Persian, but Persian all the more so, even more so than Arabic, an izafe is this grammatical feature that establishes a semantic connection between any two words. So anytime you're trying to describe something, it's an izafe, this little syllable this little short I, that connects the noun to the adjective. Or if you are trying to describe ownership, right? The poet's house, the house of the poet, this little vowel, this izafe, will connect the two. This is a poem about parting, and so he doesn't use izafes. And so in the very sound of it, there's this, right, staccato-ness to it, which I would argue is enhancing the separation. Many of the half lines in this poem have no izafes. Almost, at most, they have one izafe, with one singular exception, which I think builds to a mini climax towards the beginning of the poem when he's setting it up. So men joda gere konan, abr joda, yar joda. Usually, one half line is approximately a sentence or a half sentence. He has three short little sentences right here, very staccato, right? I am separated, weeping. The cloud is separated. The beloved is separated. And then three more very short lines. The sprouts are fresh, the air fragrant or joyous, the garden bright green. These very short staccato two-word sentences with no izafes, and then we suddenly get the one half line that has multiple izafes, and it sort of sets you up for a climax. Al bolbole roy siyah monde ze gulzar joda, separate at the end, coming at the very end of the line. So the one izafe chain that we're given, suggesting a sort of connection. It's of course a fabled connection in Persian literature. The nightingale, who is standing up to the point of utter fatigue, longing over the rose, which of course is cruel and never returns his love. You get this as off chains, suggesting the first grammatical feeling or sort of sonic feeling of connection, and then it's frustrated immediately with the last word of the line, juda, separate. Another thing I'll say about this poem is I think Prashant's poem gave much more of a flavor of the Indicness, the South Asianness of the poem, but that's also on display here with the sort of characteristic monsoon season that characterizes this poem. Rain, of course, has a presence in classical Persian poetry elsewhere, further west, but it takes on new life and new sort of shades and new kinds of color in South Asia. Abro baran o man o yar setade be vada. The clouds and the rain, and I and my beloved, waiting to say farewell. This is something interesting in South Asian literature generally, right? Predating the coming of Islam to South Asia. The monsoon season is a long established trope, north to south. The monsoon season, it's the season of love, right? You have these endless rains falling down. To put it simply, you have nowhere to go. You're not going to go outside. You're stuck in the house. There's nothing to do but make love, right? And so it's this season of intense, enhanced lovemaking. This is long established, going back centuries upon centuries. Tamil literature in the far south has its own version of this, North Indian literature across the board. This is a consistent trope. And so on the one hand, the monsoon season is any description of the monsoon season for a cultivated listener will immediately provoke those sorts of emotions of love and sentiment. But it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, if you happen to be with your beloved, then the monsoon season is a great culmination of union and lovemaking. But if you happen to be separated from your beloved, then the monsoon season is agonizing. You're separated from your beloved, and there's no traveling during the monsoon season. You're going to be separate for the entire duration. So that's the established trope. Khusraw, multiple times across his corpus, does this interesting little twist on the monsoon season where the lovers are starting off together. And the monsoon season, he deploys it in a way where it's setting up a farewell. And that's what he's doing here in this poem. The clouds and the rain, and I and my beloved, waiting to say farewell. Which I think you're meant to notice that. It's a twist, it's a bit unusual. A number of scholars have tried to make some sense of this. There's been the suggestion that Khusraw uses the monsoon season this way in part because it's reflecting real-life events. For example, in one of his Mesnavis, Khusraw's Mesnavis, commemorating the historical confrontation between Sultan Kayqubad of Delhi and his estranged father, Nasiruddin Bughraq Khan, Khusraw describes, right, the marching of the two armies. It's a kind of tragedy, father pitted against son, but eventually the father and son reconcile, but there will be an inevitable parting, right? The armies come together, they happen to reconcile, but they know that this is temporary. They're going to have to go back to their respective homes, right, where they rule. And this parting happens during the monsoon season. So some scholars have said that is the source of Khusraw's twist on the monsoon trope. Other scholars have added to this personal anecdotes. I gestured earlier to some of Khusraw's letters. When one of Khusraw's patrons had been shifted to become governor of Awadh, a city in North India, Khusraw was forced to leave his mother behind in Delhi. And he was sad about this. And then his patron generously allowed him to go back and visit Delhi for a while. And Khusraw writes about his joy at being reunited with his mother. The subsequent Masnavi that Khusraw writes in praise of his patron takes place in the monsoon season. And so some have reflected from his personal experience, the monsoon season for Khusraw can become this trope where it starts off in a state of union, but is somehow impending an ultimate departure.
Ultimate separation. It's like Christmas, all the sad Christmas songs. People don't want to be alone on Christmas. So last Christmas I gave you my heart, but the very next day you gave it away. This kind of thing.
Exactly. The other standard tropes that you're seeing, on the one hand, of course, the pouring rain from the cloud is reflecting the poet's mood, right? Nature is in one sense mirroring the mood of the poet. On the other hand, there's also a contrast, right? That line that I already referenced, the joyous, fragrant spring, right? The greenery, this is what the monsoon rains, right, do. The landscape is ebullient with joy, but the poet is this black-faced nightingale, suffering in separation from the rose garden. The trope of the beloved's tresses as chains, of course, well established in classical Persian poetry, also fairly stock in South Asian literature. The blood-red eyes, right? The idea being that the eyes are weeping so much that they're turning blood red. This is likened to crying blood. This wonderful use of the pupil, right? My eyes rain down blood for you, O pupil of my eye. Perhaps other episodes of the podcast have already spoken about this, but the word for pupil, mardome chasm or mardormak, the word means little person, or little human. And the source of this is, of course, that when you're looking at your beloved, there's a complete reflection of your beloved reflected in your eye. So the entire beloved is contained within the eye. This is, of course, very pregnant for Sufi possibilities and has explicitly been used so by other figures. I would argue some of that's going on here as well. Stand strong, he's saying to this pupil of his eye, his beloved. Stand strong, don't depart on this flood of red tears. So on the one hand, monsoon season brings these gushing waters that threaten to wash everything away. He's likening that to the crying of his eyes and it literally washing away the beloved. The beloved is in his pupil, and the pupil will wash away another moment of separation, beautifully rendered. This line here, I'll no longer need the gift of sight, since after this, all that remains for the eye is parting from the gift of your visage. The word here for visage, didar, it means the face or the countenance of the beloved. It also means the sight of the beloved. It also means sight itself, right? Vision itself. That gift will be taken away. Last thing that I'll say, quick, take some clay or some dust from your path and patch the cracks in the wall. This is, I think, the most surprising moment of the use of joda at the end of the line. Quick, take some clay, pick up some clay. You're expecting it to mean patch up the cracks in this wall. Right? The cracks are, of course, the red cracks in his eyes from all of this weeping. You're expecting it to say, use this clay to patch up the wall. What it actually tells us, Zud bargir obokon rachnei divar joda. He's literally saying, separate the cracks. Separate the cracks in the wall. This is very interesting. He's almost saying, take apart the cracks in the wall. So there's not actually a patching going on. What's already cracking, he's saying, take it apart even more. Okay, so this is all set up. Let me try to get to a more Sufi rendering of this verse. Either of you feel free to disagree. But like Hafez, of course, and as I already alluded to earlier, Khusraw was explicit that he wants one and the same poem to be appreciated by this full spectrum of audience members. And so, for someone without any religious inclination whatsoever, nothing Sufi, just, a worldly politician or member of the court, they should be able to appreciate it. And everything that I've said about the poem isn't indeed meant, right, for that kind of audience. There doesn't have to be anything Sufi about it. But Khusraw does tell us that Nizam ad-Din, the Sufis of the Dargah, that's also his audience. And so the sorts of meanings I'm about to talk about may well be there. So, all right, I guess I'll start with that cracks idea. The eye becomes 100 cracks weeping for you. Quick, take some clay or some dust and not patch the cracks in the wall, separate the cracks in the wall. We've now had a Prashant already alluded to it, right? Ahmad Ghazali, Ainul Quzat, Fakhruddin Iraqi, who's immediately prior to Khusraw, and also spent some of his life in South Asia. We've had numerous iterations of the Sufi idea of the lover-lover relationship, love being itself the sort of undifferentiated source of both lover and beloved. Love itself accepts no dichotomy, accepts no duality, but divine love, God, the divine essence, willingly manifests itself as this apparent bifurcation, lover and beloved, to allow for the possibility of love. Right? There's no possibility of love without duality. What that means for the lover, the human lover, at its most simple, is that the culmination of love, duality is not acceptable, duality is not possible. And so the lover has to become nothing. Right? That's the way to transcend the duality of lover and beloved and to immerse yourself in the ocean of love itself, the divine essence itself. So what does it mean then for these cracks in his eyes to be parted, to be separated? Patching up the wall isn't an option. Patching up the wall, right, joining the beloved, a union with the beloved, that's not possible. The way for it to happen is for the lover to become nothing. Right? In short, this is the Sufi ideal of fana, of annihilation. That's the means to culminate this kind of love.
If I could just quickly, so this is kind of like the famous verse from Hafez that there's, there's between the beloved and the lover, Hafez, there's no obstacle. Hafez, you're your own veil, lift yourself. Or Rumi has the verse, I think it's in the Masnavi, where like shadows of the battlement, like the battlement, tear down the wall with the catapult, with the mangonel, so that the light can shine through. So this is what's going on. So there's like kind of veil between lover and beloved. That's this wall that sets up this duality. That's the wall of the eyes that separates inside from outside, perceived from perceiver. And that's what's being torn apart to restore the original unity, tawheed, of love.
Right, right. Another potentially Sufi valence of what's already a multi-layered theme of the monsoon season, starting at a place of union and heralding a kind of separation. The lover and the beloved, their original state is one of unity. All comes from God. All comes from the love as the divine essence. This is an impending departure. Perhaps it's a note of reference to creation itself, right? God deploying his creation, which on the one hand is a joyous thing, right? As the famous hadith of the hidden treasure would suggest, that this is God displaying his treasures, displaying his beauties and perfections to the world. But with creation also comes this sort of sadness. And this is why, from the state of original unity, the beloved and the lover, God and the human being or his creation, they're sad at this impending separation that's about to occur. That is what the raining down is, the deployment of creation, the creation of the human being, and hence the lover-beloved bifurcation.
What can you tell us about that lovely last verse about the rose?
Right. So just to read it again, I will give you my very soul. Don't depart from me. If you don't believe me, if you want more than this, take it and keep it apart. Your beauty won't last long after you leave Khusraw. The rose doesn't last long, parted from the thorn. So again, on a more worldly reading of the text, there's a wonderful, surprising, emotional moment happening. The second penultimate line is this sort of climax of this wailing, sobbing lover, right? So it's like, don't leave me, I'll give you my very soul. And then there's this sudden twist, which in a worldly level, it's true to the kind of stages of grief, I suppose you could say, where the poetic voice gets some of his self-respect back, right? And then sort of says, no, you need me. You actually need me. I've been saying I need you all this time. Like, you're going to regret leaving me, right?
Yeah, Khusraw starts negging the rose.
Exactly. And I think that's intended. I think that's meant. Simultaneously, though, what I think it means on a more Sufi level, your beauty won't last long after you leave Khusraw. The rose doesn't last long, parted from the thorn. Here, Khusraw, he started off as the nightingale, the sad black-faced nightingale. Now he's become the rose. The thorn on the rose. I think along the cosmological lines that I was suggesting earlier, it can be read in this sort of way, right? The thorn on the rose is repeatedly, right, for centuries prior to Khusraw, this acknowledgement that, with the beloved, with love itself, there always comes pain. There always comes suffering. The two go hand in hand. There's no way to separate them. If the context here is a cosmological one maybe even thinks of the day of Alest, right? The establishing of that relationship between the creature and the creator. Again, with that creation, on the one hand, yes, it actualizes the possibility of love. There's something beautiful about it, but it also inevitably carries with it this suffering, the pangs of separation. So Khusraw now, in that context, becomes the thorn, right? He's now emblematic of the separation, which is the precondition for love being possible. That's why now the creation is the thorn attached to the rose, who is the beloved God.
Right. And just like there's no you can't be a beloved unless you have a lover. Right. You can't be a celebrity without fans.
Right. And that means even for God,
right,
separation and sadness.
I was thinking of more, I mean, this might be connected, but more in terms of there can't be any Rabb or Lord without Marbub, those who are lorded over. Right. So without me, without the lover, there's nobody that appreciates your beauty. And the lover is precisely the locus of pain, just as the beloved is the locus of beauty.
Right.
So the lover is precisely the thorn, the locus of pain, and the beloved, the rose, being the locus of beauty. But without the lover, there can be no beloved. Without somebody to appreciate the beauty, that there's no beloved.
Right. Exactly. Allah jamilun wa yuhibbul jamal, right? God is beautiful and loves beauty. His beauty doesn't have an occasion to deploy itself. It doesn't have an occasion to be manifest in the absence of creation, right? God is a hidden treasure. He loves to be known, right? He needs creation, astaghfirullah, if we can talk about God's need. He needs creation in order to have an occasion to be known, to be appreciated. Yeah, the rose, it can't have its beauty. At least it can't have it manifest in the absence of the lover. Hence, Khusraw is that necessary thorn on the rose.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Very comprehensive. You can see there's a whole lot going on in this one ghazal. Professor Keshavmurthy, I want to come back to you. I know you have some other verses of Khusraw's as well that you had offered to share with us.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I've nearly completed making a translation, a blank verse English translation of The Nine Skies, which is a poem he composed in his mid-60s in 1318 in Delhi at the court of Sultan Qutbuddin Mubarak Shah Khaliji. The excerpt I've chosen from there is about the languages of India. It's from the famous third chapter, which is often culled for facts, as it were, especially Khusraw's views on different languages of India. But I think it's more interesting than that, especially if you pay attention to its poetics. So in describing the circumstances that led him to compose the poem, Khusraw describes bolting awake from a dream in which a cloud pelts him with pearls. And he interprets the cloud, as I said a moment ago, as the Sultan, until an actual invitation from the Sultan to send him poems, presumably ghazals, to be performed at his banquet, allays his anxious uncertainty. Okay, and then fate appears to him personified, to Khusraw, and fate describes to him a conversation taking place at the Sultan's court about the relative merits of poets in different poetic forms. So it gives you a sense of Khusraw's own sense of his relationship with the canon of Persian literature. So fate says to him, it then added that in each land today, the composition of ghazals burgeons. All persons are consumed by this one form, staying ignorant of all the other forms. I know no one of such soul and temper as to compose a poem of inquiry. Right? So the word fate uses for inquiry is tahqiq. Now, this dream of the pearl-raining cloud, of course, is simultaneously a dream of poetry and wealth, or poetry as wealth. Pearls are a conventional metaphor for verse, especially since the Perso-Arabic noun Nizam literally means threaded pearls. But pearls are also a metonym for the unambiguously literal wealth Khusraw seeks. And so you have, as I said a moment ago, a tension traversing this poem, as it does the quintet of his predecessor Nizami, between the quantifiable value of poetry as a luxury commodity and its qualitative value drawn from Sufi mystical experience, which is irreducible to the court. But Khusraw goes beyond this claim to Sufi-mediated divine inspiration by distinguishing his poem in theme and form. Fate's word above for inquiry, tahqiq, covers Sufi and philosophical inquiry into reality, as well as being a verbal noun, of course, in Arabic for scholarship. And it anticipates the multiple themes this poem will go on to address, while implying that it will subsume all other particularistic forms into itself, even as it exceeds them. Right? Now, formally speaking, this is true. Like many other medieval Persian literary prose and verse poems, The Nine Sky replicates the laudatory gestures of a tripartite Persian or Arabic qasida or panegyric. Every one of its sections ends as a panegyric's exordium or nasib would end, by genuflecting towards the patron, in this case the Sultan. And every chapter ends with a ghazal, all this while encased in the form of a masnavi. Right? So it's formally ingenious, and in fact, the title of every chapter is in a distinct meter to the chapter itself. And if you line up all the chapter titles, they make up a qasida, a panegyric. So it's polymetric and polythematic and polyformal. So fate then adds, it says to Khusraw, also it said, as far as singing goes, each poet boasts of being renowned in song, but we deem only him to be a poet, from whose stock we win 100-hued jewels. Right. Now, the metaphor here of jewels that variously reflect the light shown on them perhaps acknowledges the other ways in which this poem distinguishes itself from all Perso-Arabic precedent. As I said a moment ago, the choice to commemorate, praise, instruct, and offer veiled criticism of a living king, in this case Sultan Mubarak Shah, was unprecedented in Persian, but had precedence in Sanskrit epic poetry and prose, especially poetry, right? You have Bana and Harshacharita, you have Vikramadeva Charita and Belhan, 11th century. So he arguably knew of these precedents. Also the unprecedented and proudly proclaimed choice to compose each chapter in a different meter and to end each chapter with a ghazal in a longer meter imitates the conventions of Sanskrit epic poetry. And yet, the combined effect of these metrical switches between chapters and the embeddings of ghazals in his masnavi and the rhetorical and thematic resemblances to Sanskrit literature is disparate to that of his Sanskrit models. I don't think it's his aims were rather distinct to any of his arguably Sanskritic models, right? The difference lies in tone. So the passage I want to share with you today, it's a section from the third sky or chapter. The chapter is well known because historians have often culled from it the proofs of Khusraw's patriotism, his love for India, which of course, I mean, it's not that he was insincere about it. He clearly did love India, but the scholars misrecognize the tone of these so-called proofs, which should keep us from taking them at face value. Right? Khusraw's own words his words are ratified as science, which of course backs up his claim that it's tahqiq, right? Now, while his proofs of India's paradisiac status imitate modes of reasoning from juridical and geographical discourses, his actual reasons for India's preeminence are actually sensational and flimsy, sometimes punning in ways that undo themselves. So an example of this would be, having introduced the topic of Sanskrit and the four Vedas composed in it. He says, in knightly lore, they, as in these texts, are called the four Vedas, Ved. But in South Asian pronunciation it would be Bed, but in modern Iranian pronunciation it would be Beed, which, like the willow, which is Beed, bear no fruit at all. Since the willow is not a fruit-bearing tree, the verse puns on the key noun Beed, pronounced Bed in South Asian vocalization of Persian vowels, which is a homonym for the Veda and willow, right? This can't be tahqiq. I mean, it's not, scholarship doesn't behave like this. It's adab that behaves like this, right? And likewise, at the end of the chapter, he says, at the end of his contention that the Brahmins of India worship and affirm the oneness of God, Tawheed, he says they worship only Dev, actually, which means God in Sanskrit, but also demon in Persian, right? So if Khusraw's rational proofs of India's paradise on earth status imitate the Perso-Arabic genre of the virtues, fadail, of places, their intrinsic improbability and sensationalism and their puns on key nouns put his high seriousness into question, making it seem parodic, right? Okay, so this is the passage that I want to share with you. I'll read out the English. If you want to read out the Persian, maybe I'll just read out the English. So, like Arabic, for the Quran was trained, pure, made wondrous worldwide by eloquence. All other languages are each unique, each piquant by a flavor quite distinct. This person trumpets, my language is best. That one thinks, mine is brighter than the rest. Each person's wholly lost in his own cups. No one winces, my vat has vinegar. Which is, no one admits to defects in their own language. In sum, it's fruitless that I should be glad of Persian, Turkish, or Arabic. As I'm from India, it's better that one discourse with ease on one's very own place. There is in this land in every region, a language proper to it, not borrowed. Sindhi, Lahori, Kashmiri, Kibar, Tilangi, Dhor, Samandari, Gujar, Ma'bari, Gauri, Bengal, and Awadh, Dehli, and all that lies within these bounds. All this is Hindavi that for ages people have used for all manner of speech. There is, though, one language among others that's distinguished and favored by Brahmins. It's been called Sanskrit from ancient times. Common people know nothing of its rules. Brahmins know it, and yet not all Brahmins can fathom the limits of that language, for its grammar is made up, like Arabic, of rules, syntax, terms, and literary texts. They have 4 scriptures in their Vedic faith, whose precepts form the ground of their conduct. In knightly lore, they call the 4 Vedas, Bed, which, like the willow, bear no fruit at all. All of that which pertains to eloquence, as well as principles for all the arts, and all the rest of their tales and legends, their books, letters, and their proclamations, are set down in the words of the Brahmins and in those of adab-trained connoisseurs. It's a language in form, a royal pearl, lesser than Arabic, above Persian. Although Persian's all candid and sweetness, Sanskrit's expressions are flavored no less. Each person who knows its rules by study will speak no more of its lacks and fullness. Had I knowledge of that language's rules, I would extol the emperor in it too. The earth's axis, Put, which is a pun on Qutbuddin, his patron. The earth's axis, whose throne equals the sky's axis within this ancient turning world.
Wow, that's great, lovely translation too.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this one is in the Masnavi form. Then
this is in the Masnavi form. The entire the Nine Skies is a Masnavi in its overall form, but it simulates the ghazal. In this case, the fact that this section ends, like every section, with praise for the Sultan by taking his name, Axis, punning on his name, Axis, replicates the
Qasida. Qasida Madh.
Precisely. So yeah. So.
No, that's. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I'm still stunned by Khusraw's formal brilliance in constructing this nine sky and inventiveness as well, just sheer creativity. Professor Nair, did you have any other verses that you wanted to share with us before we moved on to discuss broader themes and concepts?
Sure, yes. I have one more ghazal. This is usually number 866 in his complete diwan. Again, I've modified it from Palazinski and Sunil Sharma's translation from In the Bazaar of Love. This particular ghazal, a number of sources, both pre-modern and modern, report it as one that Khusraw composed specifically for the context of the dargah, of the mazar. And so I think, whereas with the previous ghazal, I went through the performance of explicitly reading it sort of at multiple levels, multiple valences. This one, I'll just more straightforwardly jump in, and I have less to say about the poetics here, and we'll try to tease out the Sufi meanings that might not be apparent at first glance. Again, even though this is a ghazal that has been tagged one way or another as one that Khusraw wrote specifically for Nizamuddin's audience, for that context, there really isn't anything in it that jumps out as being markedly different from any of his other ghazals. Like Hafez, he has this sort of consistent tone, and it can be read by multiple audiences in multiple ways.
عشقت خبر ز عالم بیهوشی آورد اهل صلاح را به قدح نوشی آورد رخسار تو که توبه صد پارسا شکست نزدیک شد که رو به سیه پوشی آورد شوق تو شحنه ایست که سلطان عقل را موی جبین گرفته به چاوشی آورد.
That's roughly halfway through, but I'll leave it there just to give you a taste. So here's the translation. Love for you brings news of a world beyond consciousness, and brings the pious folk to drink down goblets of wine. Your cheek broke the repentant vows of 100 chaste devotees, and nearly had them wearing black. Yearning for you is the sheriff who seizes Sultan Reason by the forelock, and hauls him before the herald. Since dying by your sword is easy, one already dead is inclined to take less effort. A drink, I implored, from those lips for a madman's sake. This is an elixir, he replied, that induces unconsciousness. Remembering a certain someone, I grew weak. Oh, doctor, offer a medicine, please, to bring on forgetfulness. Khusraw, if a fairy spell is not upon your head, cover your eyes from the spell that spells madness. This word madness, madhush, could also be perplexity, bewilderment. All right, so starting with the first verse, the first line. Love for you brings news of a world beyond consciousness and brings the pious folk to drink down goblets of wine. Some of this should be obvious, but I'll spell it out. A world beyond consciousness is bihush. One quickly thinks in the Sufi context of fana, again, specifically one of the Quranic classical loci of the idea of fana in the Quran, the episode of Moses and the mountain, where Moses asks God to reveal himself. Give me a direct sight of you. God effectively says, no, man, you can't handle it. And then says, here's what we'll do. I'll reveal myself to the mountain. You just watch the mountain. God reveals himself to the mountain. What happens? The mountain crumbles, and Moses, just having this indirect look at God, falls unconsciousness. Sufis have routinely, by this point, interpreted this as a reference to fana. In context here, Khusraw is talking about a perception or a mode of consciousness that goes beyond conventional appearances, perceiving the divine reality underneath. As the Quran tells us, of course, wheresoever you turn, there is the face of God. The second half line, this world beyond consciousness, love, which brings the pious folk to drink down goblets of wine. Wine is, of course, routinely been used by Sufi poets in this sort of way. As Khusraw tells us, this is wine from a world beyond consciousness, This is the wine of the next world, the wine, you could say, of paradise, not the wine of this world, though through following the Sufi path, the wine of the next world is indeed available to us in this world. Here we see what is fairly standard for Sufi poets, an overturning of norms broadly, Apparent belief is really unbelief, and apparent unbelief is actually truly belief. So apparent piety is really just hypocrisy and ego, You think in mind the standard Sufi tropes of the scholar or the judge who spend their entire lives learning from books, but never learn even a hint of genuine love for God. At the same time, in turn, apparent impiety is really sincere piety. Hafez's libertine in the wine tavern is, of course, one who is actually genuinely, passionately in love with the beloved, the Sufi ideal of remembering God at each instant and being drunk on his presence, which is available, again, wheresoever you turn, as the Quran tells us. So the truly pious shatter the forms and taste directly of the divine reality hidden underneath. Hence we have the second line, Your cheek broke the repentant vows of 100 chaste devotees and nearly had them wearing black. Right, the breaking of vows of repentance, what would seem an impiety and a turning away from the divine beloved. The word tawbah, repentance, actually literally means turning, right? What would seem a turning away from the divine beloved to conventional expectations is in fact a sincere turning towards the beloved. What seems a breaking of tawbah is actually true tawbah, a true turning towards God. The third verse here, yearning for you is the sheriff who seizes Sultan Reason by the forelock and hauls him before the herald. This is, I think, the most pregnant line in the ghazal. The word for sheriff here is shahneh. Shahneh is often a low-ranking official. I'm not sure exactly which meaning of the word Khusraw has in mind here, but shahneh is often a servant to the tax gatherer or an overseer of the bazaar or at the marketplace. It could be a word for the keeper of the horse stables or the elephant stables, or it could be a sort of regional mayor or vicegerent. Clearly, this person is not the chief in charge, and this is usually not somebody directly associated with the capital city, you could say. So basically, we have this lowly official, we have maybe this regional mayor, something like that, a lowly sheriff from outside the capital city, barging in and toppling the king, right? Toppling Sultan Aql, right? Sultan Reason or intellect. Interestingly, shahneh is also a term used in certain contexts to refer to the Prophet Muhammad, who's, again, this relative nobody from a dusty podunk Arabian desert, and nobody thought the next great empire was going to come from there. This lowly shahneh, the Prophet Muhammad, brought God's message to the world and ended up toppling empires. In Khusraw's hand, the core of that shahneh's message is one of longing, of sincere yearning for the beloved. So it's the apparent lowliness of love, something which haughty theologians and legal scholars, indeed reason itself, might scoff at, in fact contains the power to topple everything and to seize your entire being, top to bottom, and attach you to the beloved. Right, so yearning for the sheriff who seizes Sultan Reason by the forelock. This word here, I think it's a reference to the famous image from the Quran, most prominently in Surah Hud, this expression that God has us by the forelock. In Sufi hands, the basic idea here, it's a kind of meditation on free will. The idea here is that the shepherd who has the cattle, the beast by the forelock, the beast is going to go where it's led, right? It's going to end up wherever the shepherd wants it to go. The question is whether the beast goes willingly or unwillingly, right? That's really what it comes down to. And so reason may think it knows what's best. Reason may think it knows where it's supposed to go. But love and the beloved, in fact, know better. The herald here, right? So yearning for you is the sheriff who seizes Sultan Reason by the forelock and hauls him before the herald. The word for herald here is chavush. The chavush is a military commander, some kind of royal messenger or representative, sometimes even the royal bodyguards, depending on the context. So a higher ranking official for sure than the shahneh, someone who does directly represent the sultan at the very least, but this chavush is being convinced to turn against his sultan, you could say, Sultan Reason, Sultan Aql. Turning against Sultan Reason, as it were, to imprison, perhaps even execute the sultan for his crimes. I retained the meaning of herald in the translation, however, because I think it gives us all these lovely resonances. For instance, the bringer of good news, which again makes you think of the Prophet Muhammad, who brought the good news to the world. Perhaps even Nizamuddin Awliya, who's the bringer of good news to that context, and one who is, as Prashant so lovingly told us at the start of this interview, in some ways opposed to the authority of the courts and the realm of the intellect at the same time. This idea of the herald, to my ears at least, also makes us think of the potentially bad news of the Day of Judgment. Right? Which again, our fate on that day, the news that is brought to us by the herald, is dependent on the manner of our reaction to being grabbed by the forelock. Do we go where the beloved and love is trying to lead us willingly, or do we follow the aql and resist? The next line tells us Khusraw's answer to the question, since dying by your sword is easy, one already dead is inclined to take less effort. Right? Submit. Better to just submit. Give up intellect and its pretensions to knowing what's best and its assertion of free will. Best to just submit. Make yourself submissive, make yourself nothing. Follow the flow of wherever love leads you. So no effort is required. Renounce your own will and give in to the divine will. This expression here, one already dead, one who is more-de, again, to my ears, it makes one think of the particular hadith, which is well trodden across the annals of South Asian literature, where the Prophet Muhammad tells us to die before you die. Right? One also thinks of Halaj in this context, who is perhaps the madman, or the model of the madman who is referenced in the next verse. A drink, I implored, from those lips for a madman's sake. This is an elixir, he replied, that induces unconsciousness. Halaj, right, this precise madman who is willing to die before he dies. The next line, remembering a certain someone, I grew weak. O doctor, offer a medicine, please, to bring on forgetfulness. Forgetfulness, again, a reference to that phrase from the opening line, a state, a condition beyond consciousness, a turning away from the apparent world of appearances, from the pain and separation from the beloved that it entails. Right, the poetic voice crying out, please take me away from it, take me out of it. The doctor may again, I wonder, perhaps be the intellect. That is a standard trope. The doctor who is representative of the intellect, unable to really diagnose the love sickness that is at play. Perhaps that's a resonance here. I'm not so sure if this is the faulty doctor or a more genuine doctor. The last line, Khusraw, if a fairy spell is not upon your head, cover your eyes from the spell that spells madness, or perplexity, or bewilderment. You need to be drunk, right? You need to be mad. You need to be intoxicated in order to understand love. You don't need the medicine of the intellect, of reason, of the akal, but rather you need to be under a spell. You need to be love-struck. That's the precondition, right? Only then will you be ready for bewilderment, for perplexity. This kind of Sufi ideal for lovers that goes long back to the likes of Rumi, famously Attar and the Mantiquter. These advanced valleys of the way are characterized by hayrat, bewilderment or perplexity.
Oh, thank you very much for that tour of a very lovely ghazal with typically intense, very powerful imagery. I'd like to turn now quickly. I think we've covered a lot of these already in our discussions of the poetry, but Professor Keshavmurthy, are there any other main concepts, themes, or motifs that are of central importance to Khusraw's poetry that you want our listeners to be aware of?
I have nothing significant to add to what Shankar has gone over. I think thematically, for the most part, he's continuous with the Sufi poetic tradition, especially the ghazal tradition, right? So I don't think his thematic range spills out of that significantly. There is perhaps more of an emphasis on certain themes because of his location. Say, as I said, for example, the motif of slavery, servitude, and the ethics of servitude, depending on which sultan, right? Is it the worldly sultan or the sultan of the next world? There is an emphasis on the pagan or Brahmin beloved, but that's it. I don't think these in thematically are thematically distinct. They're distinct motifs, but perhaps not distinct themes.
I think Prashant's exactly right. Thematically, I don't know that Khusraw very much expands the range. I think it's the deployment, the act of poetry where Khusraw is leaving a very distinct and quite fantastic mark. So, right, the poetics of Ravani, which Prashant already mentioned, Khusraw identifies this as one of the chief characteristics, defining characteristics of his poetry, though, yes, he doesn't really tell us a great deal about what it is. You just sort of have to feel it, I suppose. So I would argue it's not a theme or a concept, but it's one of the sort of defining hallmarks of his poetry and what poetry does in the context of an audience. He describes it sometimes, his Ravani, his fluency or his flow, as water-like, it's delicate, it has a gentle softness, and it can set fire to even the coldest of hearts. I'm very fond of that description. Another, again, not necessarily theme, but characteristic of his poetry that I'd want to re-emphasize, we already talked about it a bit earlier, but it's just his abiding interest in music. He describes music as adorning poetry like an ornament on a bride. We have a number of indications that he was deeply interested in musical theory, though we don't have any extant treatises, just references to music theory in his poems, constant references to maqams and pardas and all these different terms from music theory. Many scholars have suggested that Khusraw combines the Indian raga musical system with the Arabic or Persian maqam and parda systems, and have innovated new musical modes. So that would have been on his mind, that musical context when he's composing his poetry. He innovated, it's said, the tarana genre, which again, it's these onomatopoetic strings of meaningless syllables interspersed with other bits of poetic lines, which are now very standard in South Asian music. Again, we've talked a lot about Khusraw's pride at being a Hindavi poet, but it just stands to emphasize that again in this question. His various uses of a kind of vernacular register, his echoes of vernaculars, indigenous South Asian Geet or Doha genres, certain tropes that he, from a South Asian Indic context, that he incorporates into his poetry, the classical Persian trope of the ashiq, right? The lover, the ideal of the lover, is combined with Indic tropes, for example, of the virahini, which is the female voice, right? The voice of the female pining in separation from her beloved. We get repeated references, for instance, to the South Asian holiday of Holi, right? This festival of color associated with Krishna, first and foremost. It peppers a lot of his poetry, and it's often in the context of when he's talking about Sheikh Nizam ad-Din, in fact, that these references to Holi pop up. Prashant already talked a bit about īhām, which alongside Ravani, this is another of the one or two or three central characteristics that Khusraw identifies as being his own particular genius, these puns, these riddles. As Prashant already mentioned, from a scholarly perspective, it's very uncertain whether these sort of Hindavi riddles can faithfully be attributed to Khusraw. But from the perspective of the tradition, at least, in South Asia, it's completely assumed that he wrote all of these delightful riddles. And so just the playfulness, the real utter playfulness of Khusraw really shouldn't be forgotten. I'll just give one example here of a kind of mixed language, vernacular riddle pun. So first, in Persian, he writes, "What does a thirsty person need?" And then in Hindi Urdu, he writes, "What is required for union?" And then the answer is this pun. The word is cha, which in Persian, it means well, right? A well will give you water to quench your thirst. But in Hindi Urdu, it means desire, right? So just to give you an example, these are, of course, not reliably attributed to Khusraw, but the tradition remembers them as very much being his.
Yeah, he also puns. He takes pride on inventing an īhām with 7 meanings across 3 languages. And I think in his Diboche and the preface to his third divan, and he puns on the word nar, which, if with a kasra, vocalized with a kasra, becomes nari, which is lady or woman in Hindi, but fire in Arabic and Persian. So building on this sort of macaronic punning, he generates 7 meanings, right? And he takes pride in it. So.
Wow. Jay-Z was proud of his triple entendre. Khusraw's got a 7-fold, I don't even know how to say, 7-fold entendre across, septifold entendre across 3 languages. That's pretty impressive.
No, I can't resist saying it just because it's so amusing. Khusraw's abiding love of mangoes, it seems. This is perhaps the truest proof of the superiority of South Asia over anywhere else in the world. It's the mango. And so I'll just share one of these riddles again of dubious authorship, but it's just so delightful. The riddle reads, "I saw a wondrous child in the land of Hindustan. His skin covered his hair, and his hair covered his bones. The answer is mango." That's the answer to this riddle.
That's clever.
Very fond of mangoes. Yes. So I think we can call this a theme of his poetry.
Excellent. Well, I can't blame him for that. Well, all right. So we mentioned the debauche. We mentioned these features of his poetry, and that he was very self-conscious of his own poetic prowess. Spoke a lot about what made good poetry. Could you tell us a little bit about what Khusraw has to say about poetry itself, about Khusraw's metapoetics? Or why did he choose to write in poetry in the way that he did? And what does he have to say about poetry and the power of poetry?
I'll do my best, yes. The text in question, the preface, the debauche to Khusraw's third collection of poetry, which is called the Ghurat al-Kamal. We can tentatively translate this as the full moon of perfection. The Khusraw is punning relentlessly in this preface, and every word has at least 2, if not more than that, meanings. This was compiled around 1293 or 1294, when Khusraw was approximately 43 years old. He writes interesting prefaces to all of his diwan collections, but this one is arguably the most interesting. It's a truly unique composition. For everything that we've been saying about Khusraw's poetry, he's also very proud of his prose, and it really is marked by a very distinctive style. On the one hand, Khusraw is clearly showing off his incredible breadth of learning across a remarkable variety of disciplines, deploying all of the characteristic vocabularies and technical terms of all these traditions simultaneously in intricate double and triple meanings. He often uses a technical term from one genre or one discipline and applies it to a different genre, a different discipline in very surprising and unexpected ways, and weaves subtle and complex metaphors out of them. Just to give you one example, at one point Khusraw is talking about the discipline of mantiq, of logic, and specifically the four main forms of syllogism that characterize logic. There's four forms you can put a successful argument into. Khusraw takes these four categories and applies them to four varieties of poetry, where there's a kind of inversion going on. Simultaneously, the words that Khusraw has chosen, the odd words he's chosen to refer to these four forms of syllogisms, and he's now innovating a categorization of four forms of poetry therefrom, the words he's using for each of these categories are words that are drawn from a sort of medical terminology or natural philosophy related to the four elements and the four bodily humors, right? Dry, wet, cold, and hot. He at no point acknowledges that discipline in that section of the debauchee. You're just expected to have the kind of very, very broad learning to recognize it, and he leaves you quite free to make of it what you will. So it's an extremely challenging text. I'll just say a few highlights that I've been able to glean from it. Khusraw initiates the debauchee with this sort of extended cosmological analogy, a kind of cosmopoetics, if you will, that he keeps calling back to across the whole preface. God, in short, is the first poet. He is the creator of language, and he gifted language to humankind. Khusraw grounds these assertions in numerous quotes from the Quran. He starts off with Surah Rahman, right? God created, with Surah Rahman, Ar-Rahman, allama al-Quran, khalaqa al-insan, allamahu al-bayan, right? So God created humankind and gave him the gift of eloquent expression. Khusraw also consistently grounds his assertions in numerous hadith. Here at the very opening of the debauchee, it's the hadith that God created Adam upon his form, so suggesting the deiformity of the human being. Adam is referred to as an instance of kinaya, of sort of metonymy. So again, God is the first poet, and the cosmos that he creates is his poem. Right? So every human, every creature in this cosmic poem is, right, a particular line of that poem or a particular feature, a literary feature of it, right, the rhyme or the refrain or what have you. Each creature or human who is a verse within God's poem, Khusraw gives us an elaborate description of the qualities and deeds of human beings, which serve as ornaments and embellishments to God's literary creation, which is the cosmos. Then, Khusraw continues, God sent us the prophets. And then God subsequently sent us the scholars and the Awliya, right, the saints or the friends of God who extend and preserve that knowledge for us. But the climactic point here is when God gave language to the poets. The poets speak in a kind of lofty speech. Here, Khusraw likens this to the Quranic references to dhikr. Right? Their lofty speech, the most eloquent of all human beings, is likened to remembering God much, right? Dhikran kathiran. Khusraw then continues the cosmological analogy and brings it down to the level of literary composition. Khusraw again is quoting Quranic verses relating to the Day of Judgment and Paradise, which are all likened to a literary composition in a punning style. So for instance, we've talked about this concept of Ravani. Khusraw talks about Ravani. Again, he's not describing it. He's using the term. You're meant to pick up on the reference. And he's using the word Ravani in the context of quoting Quranic descriptions of the rivers that flow underneath the gardens of paradise. The 8 gates or doors of paradise, he's using the word beit, of course, which makes you think of verses, poetic verses. He's using the word mizan, right? The weights or the scales of good deeds and bad deeds that determine our fate in the afterlife. Mizan is, of course, a word in the context of prosody, right? Verse or meter. All of this is tied up. The word for tied up also means a musical refrain. And he calls this refrain that characterizes the entire poem of creation with the Quranic verse, Kullu man alayha fan, right? Whatsoever is upon the earth is fleeting, is destroyed, and all that remains is the face of God. So God's miraculous gift of speech to humankind is one that's characterized by hikmah, Right? How do you translate hikmah? Wisdom, knowledge, what have you. And hikmah is only available to the most excellent of creation. I won't belabor the details, but Khusraw goes into a fairly lengthy section, which is drawn from falsafa terminology of the plant soul, the animal soul, the rational soul. He argues at significant length on the superiority of the rational soul. I'm not quite sure why he felt the need to give such an extended argument. This would have been uncontroversial. But clearly, though Khusraw is appropriating the language of Falsafa, Ibn Sina, Islamic philosophy, to talk about the rational soul, undeniably on his mind is, of course, the root meaning of the word rational, right? Nafs al-natiqa, which is a speaking soul, right? It means rational and speaking at the same time. Khusraw is, of course, trying to remind everyone of the speaking side of this word, which had been sort of ossified as just meaning rational soul. Eloquent speech now is now core to what the rational soul, the speaking soul, right, the nafs natiqa, is able to do. The people who are truly knowledgeable know that knowledge cannot be manifest in the world in the absence of eloquent speech. Eloquent speech is the bridge that allows this knowledge to become manifest in the world and to be known by creatures. So meaning, Khusraw says, requires the form of expression, but the reverse is not necessarily the case. It's not necessarily the case that form depends upon meaning. Meaning depends upon form. In the hands of these eloquent speakers, the gifts and treasures of the ghaib, of the unseen world, are now made available. God is the first hakim, right, the originally wise one. It's these poets who are the supreme exemplars of what it means to be a sage, a wise, learned sage, a hakim, here on this earth. Again, we have numerous Quranic references peppering the text. For example, God formed you and then made beautiful your forms. References to the creation of humankind out of clay. It's peppered all over the verse, all over the passage, excuse me. Just to finish up, Khusraw outlines the ideal formation of a poet. It's quite staggering, the depth and breadth of learning that Khusraw expects. Khusraw speaks affirmatively of learning all of the sciences: Quran, Hadith, theology, law, logic, and so on. A good poet must know all of these, in addition to knowing all of the poetic greats that precede him of every genre, every rhetorical flourish. It's really quite staggering, the kind of learning that Khusraw is articulating. Finally, we turn to a section of the Dibauche where Khusraw quotes the well-known hadith that from poetry comes wisdom, right? From sha'r comes hikmah. And this is the hadith that I'm sure has come up numerous times in this podcast, the idea of poetry as licit magic. Khusraw says clearly, to be a true poet means to be a knower, an alim, an alim. And he says the Quran itself tells us this. A poet is also a hakim, as I mentioned, right? A true, learned, wise sage. So this licit magic of poetry grants wisdom and knowledge. Do either of you know the source of this Arabic phrase? لو كان نزول الوحي بعد الأنبياء لنزل على شعراء والفصحاء. If there's a descent of wahi after the prophets, then he has descended it upon the poets and the eloquent ones.
I've heard it before, but I don't know its provenance.
It's okay. All right. Khusraw ends up quoting this Arabic expression. I don't know where it comes from. He makes it sound like scripture. He's just quoted the well-known Quranic verse, "Ma arsalnaka illa rahmatan lil alamin." Right? We did not send you, Muhammad, except as a mercy to all the worlds. Immediately after, Khusraw quotes this other Arabic expression. I don't know where it comes from. لو كان نزول الوحي بعد الأنبياء لنزل على الشعراء والفصحاء. If there is a descent of wahi, of, how do you want to translate wahi, revelation, inspiration, after the prophets, then it has descended upon the poets and upon those of eloquent speech. So this is quite a lofty expression of what poetry does, its crucial function in the world. I'll say briefly, by way of reflecting on this passage, that whereas prior to Khusraw, in at least sort of the main line of Arabic literary theory, we've seen this fairly concerted move, this fairly deliberate move to separate poetry from questions of truth value. Right, it's wrong-headed to hold poetry to the standards of truth or falsehood. Khusraw, I think, is undeniably undermining that to a certain extent. True poetry is somehow this expression of the real truths of the beyond and of the unseen and expressions of God. I don't think we should take that simplistically. I don't think we should. It would be a great injustice to reduce that to some kind of expectation that every poem is expressing some kind of rational statement or rational truth or something like that. No, right? Poetry is magic. It's a kind of alchemy. It does a kind of work on the soul. But part of the central function of poetry, as Khusraw is at least articulating here, is to be this vehicle of the truths of God, the truths of the next world, in a language that can successfully convey those realities to the properly cultivated audience.
Thank you. That's a fantastic summary of a very dense and difficult introduction to Khusraw's metapoetics. Thank you. Professor Keshavmurthy, do you have anything to add on Khusraw's theory of poetry, how poetry works, why it's so important?
Broadly, yeah, I would, I can't really improve on what Shankar has said, but broadly I would add that I see Khusraw as a member or a participant in what Marshall Hodgson in The Venture of Islam calls the early middle period contest. This is 950 to 1250 circa, right? But Khusraw post-states 1250, but basically he's a late participant in this contest. Marshall Hodgson identifies between the ulama and the udaba, right? Between poets, Nizami, Khusraw, Nasir Khusraw, and Anbari, before the generation before Khusraw, and Khaqani in Khusraw's time. All of them in different ways, but none of them in so extensively as Khusraw and his debauchery, but all of them champion sher over ilm, poetry over scholarship, and on some very few occasions, ilm over sher, scholarship over poetry, right? And so I think I see Khusraw specifically overturning the Sufi Persian poet Sanai Ghaznavi's position. Sanai dies in 1120, I think 1193, roughly, is when he dies. His position in his preface to his divan, that one of the conditions under which a man survives his own death is that he take pride in his poetry, and Sanai says that this is because it's knowledge that benefits poetry as it comes from wisdom, right? And bespeaks piety unlike other knowledges that are destructive. So Sanai speaks of metaphysics that is hobbled by desire, calculation which veils the subtleties of faith, and the science of the stars or astrology, which is infidelity. Khusraw overturns this by presenting poetry as including wisdom, piety, metaphysics, calculation, and astrology, while exceeding their sum, while being more than their sum, right? So for Khusraw, as Shankar says, poetry is the sort of the most encompassing of these categories and includes hikmah rather than the other way around. He points that out, Khusraw points that out explicitly. So in this sense, I think, Khusraw is, in a way, I would say this, I say this sort of tentatively, but if you compare Nizami, his model, at least in his narrative poetry, Nizami's pronouncements on Sukhan, which means both speech as well as poetry. You look at his famous chapter on Sukhan in Mahsan al-Asrar, the Treasury of Secrets, the first of Nizami's poems in his quintet. He speaks there of Sukhan as the sort of a pre-human first mover, an unmoved mover, sort of probably from, almost certainly actually, I would say from Al-Farabi mediated Aristotle. This is the divine speech act that brings the world into being. And God as disclosing himself or breaking out of his own solitude as speech, recognizably from the Gospel of John. But there's another sense in which Nizami uses Sukhan in the main text of his narrative poems, which is interhuman speech. So there's a kind of horizontal sense and a vertical sense. It's never easy to work out how they relate to each other. Now, in Khusraw's case, I think what I see Khusraw as revising this Platonic distinction he inherits from Nizami, the distinction between rhetoric as truth-speaking and rhetoric as persuasion. I see him as displacing it by including truth-speaking within persuasion, which for me would perhaps explain the multi-generic, multidisciplinary rhetoric or terminology that Shankar pointed to, right? He's drawing on medicine, he's drawing on fiqh, he's drawing on falsafa, right? So rather than presenting these as alternatives, rhetoric as truth-speaking, rhetoric as persuasion, which you see in Nizami's quintet, he includes truth-speaking as a mode of persuasive speech, which is arguably why in his Matla al-Anwar, The Rising of the Lights, which is his response poem to Nizami's Hamaksan, he displaces Nizami's chapter-long meditation on Sukhan's divine cosmogonic powers, with an exclusive focus on the human uses of Sukhan as the best use of this form of frame. Qalib is the word he uses, right? He nods in the direction of Avicennian necessary, the being, wajib al-wujud, the necessary being, and speech as its manifestation, but he's not really interested in it. He quickly moves on to the interhuman uses of speech. Yeah, so I think that's what and I think this broadly explains for me the relatively far more ludic rhetorical atmosphere of Khusraw's works than those of Sana'i, Nizami, and other poets, right? Or Nasir Khusraw. Why is he so much more ludic? Why is he like a medieval Nabokov? Right? It's because he's including truth speaking within the broader category of rhetoric or form.
No, thank you. That's really helpful. Yeah, no, there's nothing's off the table for him. I mean, sheer poetry is this all-encompassing. It synthesizes. To be a poet, I mean, you have to know everything, and have all kinds of skills. No, it's. I mean, has anybody gone this far in theorizing poetry? Are you familiar with any other authors who theorize poetry like this? Because poetry seems supreme for Khusraw. At least it's like the totality of human, not even merely human wisdom, but human and divine wisdom together. Do you know of anybody, any other theorists, poets, authors who have given poetry such a lofty and important place?
In Persian, you mean?
In Persian, Arabic, I mean, really any language. I don't know if Sanskrit or other things.
Shankar can speak better to Sanskrit, but I do know that in Bedil or Bidil, the late 17th century, early who dies 60 days of 1644 to 1720, Sukhan has this kind of all-encompassing character, but I don't see in Bidil the sort of ludic, multidisciplinary, Bidil is not reaching out into ambient disciplines to then argue that Sukhan encompasses them all. It's much more just cosmogonic and sort of Ibn Arabi-esque, Akbarian. Yeah.
No. Thank you so much. This is tremendously helpful, and also gives me it's almost a view behind the curtain to see how the magic of Khusraw's poetry is being put together. It's almost the opposite of how the sausage gets made. It's because it's lovely. You're seeing the projector of the wonderful movie or something like that. All right. Well, we've run way over time, as I kind of expected us to do with Khusraw, because there's just so much to talk about. But I just wanted to ask a final question about Khusraw's contemporary life and legacy. I mean, you both mentioned that you were introduced to Khusraw through contemporary qawwali performances. We mentioned as well to the poet Bedil, who perhaps it seems to be drawing some things from Khusraw. But could you tell us a little bit about his contemporary life and legacy?
The best survey I know of, at least in English, of Khusraw's contemporary life comes from the section called The Poet in Our Time in Sunil Sharma's book, Amir Khusraw, Poet of Sultans and Sufis. And as Sunil observes, Professor Sharma observes, Khusraw's the vernacular poetry attributed to Khusraw continues to flourish across North India and Pakistan. You have qawwali performances, but you also have riddles. You have songs attributed to him sung at weddings. You've had, I think, since 2002, a festival organized in Delhi called Jasht-e-Khusraw, the Festival of Khusraw, every year, where Sufi musicians from around the world come and perform. So he remains alive, in popular memory in South Asia, largely through his through the vernacular poetry attributed to him. But he remains read and enjoyed and respected in Persian across Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and Iran. I mean, there is a dearth of his Persian corpus is very poorly served by translation, despite the books that do exist. Shankar mentioned in the Bazaar of Love, which I would say is the only. I would say it offers careful free verse translations of a selection of Khusraw's ghazals, a passage from one of his masnavis, and a selection of popular Hindi verses. It's arguably the only readable English translation of his poetry yet. To me, the best introduction to his poetics, not just his life and time. In fact, not his life and times. That's Sunil Sharma's book is better for that. Amir Khusraw, the Poet of Sultans and Sufis. It's the most comprehensive English language survey from 2015 of Khusraw's career and works. But the best introduction to his poetics is Alissa Gabbé's Islamic Tolerance, Amir Khusraw and Pluralism, Routledge 2014. It's the only study of Khusraw in any language to make a generalization about his poetics. It closely reads some of his masnavis and his debauche, his preface, to argue that Khusraw's poetics dissolves the many hierarchical dualisms that structure the history writing and jurisprudence of his milieu, such as, for example, Muslim and pagan, or Turk and Hindu, or man and woman, human and animal, right? In this sense, it's informed by Derrida, it's a deconstructionist attention to his poetics of play, And it's the best introduction I know of to his poetics, right? Especially his narrative poetics. Then apart from, in the Bazaar of Love, the selected poetry of Amir Khusraw, translated by Paul Lezensky and Sunil Sharma, and Sunil's own book, Amir Khusraw, there is, I would recommend Hassan Sidzi's Nizamuddin Awliya, Morals for the Heart, beautifully translated by Bruce Lawrence. It's not a work by Amir Khusraw, but it is an elegant translation of the discourses of Khusraw's beloved Sufi mentor. And in that sense, it makes us privy to Nizamuddin Awliya's daily Sufi discourses that Khusraw would have heard too. In terms of historical background, Sunil Kumar's The Emergence of the Delhi Sultanate, 1192 to 1286. It's a book-length study of the political and religious structures of authority, especially the culture of military slavery that Khusraw was born into. It's relevant because over scores of his ghazals, Khusraw, as I said, playfully explores the meanings of slavery to God, Sufi saint, and human beloved, surely drawing on his own identity as a descendant of manumitted military slaves. Julie Scott Maysami's medieval Persian court poetry. It's not about Khusraw, but from 1987, but it's still the best explication of the main courtly genres Khusraw inherited. And there's a very unusual and remarkable PhD thesis, never published, but available in the public domain, which is really worth reading. It's by Michael Boris Bednar from 2007. It's called Conquest and Resistance in Context, a historiographical reading of Sanskrit and Persian battle narratives, where he imaginatively compares medieval Sanskrit epic narrations of the conquest of Rajasthan, this part of Western India, by one of Khusraw's main patrons, Alauddin Khilji, with Khusraw's own Persian epic narrations of the same conquests. And it lets us imagine the crystallization of regional warrior masculinity in dialogue with its Turkic counterpart in Delhi. So you see Khusraw participating in the crystallization of a certain model of warrior masculinity in the vernacular in Western India, through a dialogic process caught up in political conquest. So that's Michael Boris Bednar's dissertation. Yeah, I mean, these are the main works I would say are relevant to Khusraw in English. So.
No, thank you. That's very, very comprehensive. Professor Nair, anything to add on Khusraw's contemporary life and legacy?
No, I think Prashant summarized it nicely. He looms large in South Asian memory and in South Asian legacy. But yes, it's a complicated status in South Asia today, if only because of the undermining of Persian. So just to make that note a little bit more loudly, the experience of colonialism and the British undermining of Persian has in large scale cut South Asians off from access to Persian. And so there's in principle, love of Khusraw, but in practice, it's largely through the vernacular, which is of doubtable attribution. I'll just add to what Prashant already said that there is something of a cottage industry of translating Khusraw into Urdu of varying quality. Some of it really not so good, some of it quite good. And for any Urdu readers out there, that of course is accessible to South Asia and has become a venue for Khusraw's continued life. And to the bibliography that Prashant already mentioned, I would second everything that he said. I would just add Shamsur Rahman Farooqi. In passing across his numerous works, he will often dive into Khusraw at various moments, snippets of translation here, reflections there. It's often wonderful, as is so characteristic of Shamsur Rahman Farooqi. He really has a feel for Khusraw that I think many of the established publications on Khusraw lacks. So just reading broadly across Shamsur Farooqi's works for any of those insights on Khusraw, they're almost always wonderful and valuable.
All right. Well, thank you both for joining us and helping us better understand and appreciate the brilliance and the beauty of Amir Khusraw's poetry and prose, I should say. I hope you listeners will tune in next time for our next episode of the Logic of the Birds podcast. Salam.